He laughed at her in front of everyone. No ring on her finger, no impressive title, no story worth telling. At least, that's what he thought. He had no idea that the woman standing quietly in front of him had already signed a marriage certificate that morning. He had no idea who her husband was, and he had absolutely no idea that the most powerful man in Chicago had been watching him from 3 steps away the entire time. Some people mistake silence for weakness. Some people mistake a bare hand for an empty life. They are always the ones who find out last. This channel exists for one reason. There are people in this world who were born to lead, not to follow. There are lessons that no classroom will ever teach you. Lessons about power, about loyalty, about how the sharpest minds in any room are never the loudest ones in it. We do not tell stories about crime. We tell stories about how certain people think, how they protect what matters and what the rest of the world never gets to see. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been the quietest person in the room and the most dangerous one, this story was built for you. The lesson here is simple and it will stay with you. Real strength does not announce itself, and the people who laugh at you today are often the ones who have no idea what you have already become. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment below and tell me the moment that hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and it will change how you see power all over again.
Nora Voss has memphis the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them told her why her father had to die. That was the thought she carried into work every night. Not with bitterness, not with tears, just a quiet, steady weight she had learned to carry the way other people carry keys. You check for it. You feel its presence. You keep moving. It was a Tuesday in November, 9:15 in the evening. The basement of the Hargrove Institute for Historical Research sat 2 floors street level, and down here, Chicago's winter could not reach you. Just the hum of the ventilation system, the long fluorescent lights, the cold concrete success, and the smell of air that Nora was noticing years ago. She was alone. She preferred it that way, especially in the evening hours. After the researchers went home, the building quieted down to almost nothing. No one asking questions, no one needing anything, just her and the work. She was processing a donation box. Someone had cleaned out a demolished building in the near north sides and sent over whatever they found. This was how archives grew, one box at a time. Nora lifted each item, assessed it in seconds, and filed it into the correct mental category. Letters, black and white photographs, old architectural drawings folded into careful quarters, property records from the 1950s. She worked fast. She always worked fast. 4 years at the Hargrove Institute had turned her into something close to a machine when it came to sorting and categorizing. She knew which details mattered and which ones didn't. She knew when something was genuinely rare and when something just looked old. She was nearly through basics when her hand found the last item. She lifted it, and she stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a gasp, just the quiet internal halt of a person whose brain has registered something wrong before the rest of her catches up. Like reading a sentence and knowing one word doesn't belong before you can name which word. A map, roughly the size of a large sheet of paper, hand-drawn, blue ink, slightly faded at the edges. It looked at a glance like a standard historical survey of Chicago's South Loop. But Nora Voss was Edmund Voss's daughter. She knew her father's handwriting before she knew anything else about the map. The particular way he formed the letter S. The way his lines connected, with a slight upward curve at the end, like a question. She had known that handwriting her entire life. And she knew the second layer underneath it. Her father had built a private language for the two of them when Nora was 9 years old. Bedtime stories, he had called them, but they were more than that. He would draw small maps and hide different meanings inside the geography. Contour lines meant something other than elevation. Water source meant something other than rivers. He said it was a game. She had understood, much later, that it was also training. She read the map for 6 seconds. Not long enough to decode everything. Long enough to understand that what she was holding was dangerous. She folded it carefully along its original crease lines and slid it the inside pocket of her coat. Then she went back to work. She processed the remaining items in the box, stamped the catalog dates, filled out the acquisition form, and finished her shift. She did not let her hands shake until she was alone in the stairwell. Her colleague, Dennis Calloway, caught her near the workroom about 30 minutes before that on his way to order pizza for the late crew. Dennis said, "Hey, we're doing deep dish from Lou Malnati's. You in?" Nora said, "I'm good. Thanks." Dennis said, "You sure? You look like you haven't eaten since that granola bar at 3." Nora said, "I ate. I just look like this." Dennis laughed and walked on. He was a good person. He noticed things about people without making it uncomfortable. Nora watched him go for 1 second, not because she wanted the pizza, but because Zest dinner presented something she had mostly set aside in the past 8 months. A normal evening. Food ordered without thinking about it. The uncomplicated pleasure of a late night with people who had nothing to worry about, except their work. She had not had that since her father died. Edmund Voss had been killed 8 months ago. The official report called it a robbery. The case had been closed every 2 hours, which was fast. Which was too fast. Nora knew what a thorough investigation looked like. She had spent 4 years cataloging historical records, including police archives, and 72 hours was not thorough. 72 hours was someone's son deciding they already knew the answer. His apartment had been searched before she arrived. Everything he had kept there, 20 years of hand-drawn maps, his notebooks, his reference materials, all of it was gone. The police report made no mention of it. She had no evidence of anything. She had no one she could tell. She had her brother Jake in Boston, finishing his final year of graduate school. She paid his tuition from her salary and sent him what she could every month, and she had not told him anything that would pull him out of his program and into this. She had the map in her pocket, and now she had something else. In the document reading room, 1 floor above the basement, there was a patron she had been noting for 2 weeks. He came near closing time, always near closing time. He was maybe 40 years old, gray wool sweater, wire-rimmed glasses, a handwritten notebook. No laptop, no phone. In the year they were living in, a person who came to a research library without a phone was unusual enough to register. She had walked past his table 3 times tonight, and each time she had felt the quiet, particular attention of someone who notices when they are being observed. The last thing she did before locking up the reading room was check it. He was still there, notebook closed, pen beside it, and he was looking in her direction before she stepped through the door. Nora said, "We closed at 9. Please, the man said, "It's 8:58. Nora said, "You've been here 4 hours and you didn't request a single document." There was a pause. Then he said, "Sometimes you come to a place to remember what it used to hold." Nora looked at him. He was not what she would call threatening. He was not what she would call safe either. He occupied a middle category she had no good label for. Then she said flat, not a question, "You knew Edmund Voss." He did not confirm. He did not deny. He stood, pulled on his coat, a plain dark gray with nothing identifying about it. But before he reached the door, he stopped. He said, "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. It's a quality worth inheriting." Then he walked out. Phil Dragomir, the building security guard, had the lobby door open before the man reached it. Nora stood in the empty reading room. Her hand was in her coat pocket. Her fingers were on the folded map. She had 34,000 documents memorized. She had no file on this man. No name, no record of any kind. And in this building, in this archive, that meant either an accident or a deliberate absence. She had stopped believing in accidents 8 months ago. She slept 3 hours, maybe less. By 5:45 in the morning, she had the map spread across her kitchen table, a pencil in her hand, and a blank sheet of paper for notes. The kitchen light was the only light on in the apartment. Outside the window, Chicago in November was still full dark. She worked through the second layer of her father's code. It was slow. It had been years since she had practiced reading it, and her father had built it with enough complexity that even she needed time. The surface of the map showed the South Loop, streets, landmarks, a section of the lakefront. But underneath that, in the secondary symbols she had learned as a child, a different picture emerged. Contour lines were not elevation, they were influence. The higher the number, the greater the reach. Water sources were not rivers, they were money flows. The way her father had drawn certain connecting links, curved slightly upward at their ends, indicated active relationships rather than historical ones. 3 names stood above the rest, marked in a notation her father reserved for the highest priority. She recognized 2 of them. The third made her hands unsteady. Senator Harlan Mast. The man was currently running for governor of Illinois. He appeared in the news every other day. He had built his entire public image on the idea of clean government and accountability. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She did not answer. It rang again. She let it go. Third time she picked up. A man's voice, calm and measured, like someone reading from a document they had already reviewed twice. He said, "I need to see the map, Miss Fuss." Not to take it. To explain it. Nora said, "How do you have this number?" He said, "Same way I knows you found it last night, ice. The same way I know you haven't slept." 8 seconds of silence. She counted them. Then she said, "Where?" He gave her an address in Pilsen, a diner she had never been to. He said 1 hour. She got there in 50 minutes. His name was Callum Reyes. He told her that himself, which she noted, because it was the kind of detail a person omits when they want to stay hard to trace. He was already seated when we arrived, at a corner table, back against the wall, positions so that he could see the door and most of the room. He had coffee waiting for both of them. She noticed he had ordered correctly, not a guess, not a default choice. The right coffee, the right way. She did not comment on it. He said, "Your father worked for me. Not officially, not on any record." Nora said nothing. She was storing what he said, not responding to it. Yet, he said he was a cartographer in the truest sense. He mapped things that couldn't be mapped openly: relationships, financial connections, leverage points. For 20 years, he documented everything I couldn't document without exposing myself or the people I protect. Norza said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because someone found out what he was doing. And I don't know who." She said, "And the map." He said, "Is either bait set for me, or it's what your father wanted someone to find. I need to know which one." She said, "And you think I can tell you that?" "I think you already know. I think you've known since last night." There was a long moment. Nora drank her coffee, set the mug down. Then she said, "He coded his maps in a system he built for me when I was 9. Bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. It was the first real thing she gave him, not because she trusted him, because this was the only path to understanding what her father had been doing and why someone had decided he needed to die for it. That evening, the Hargrove Institute held its annual donor reception, a small cocktail event for major contributors and community partners. Nora had to attend. She had managed the archive that received the year's largest document donation, and her presence was expected. She wore the one black dress she owned. She arrived alone. She brought her notebook out of habit. Ethan Cole was there. She saw him before he saw her. He was with Lacey, his fiancée. Lacey worked in marketing, had light-colored hair, and wore a red dress that's chosen to focus about a while rather than it become in a Chicago November. Nora could have taken a different path through the room. She chose not to. This was her event. She had no reasons to redirect herself for a man who had already redirected her once. Ethan spotted her near the donor acknowledgement table. He said, "Nora, hey."
The surprise in his voice was surprise, the harmless, slightly vacant surprise of someone who encounters a piece of furniture they forgot they had. Nora said, "Ethan." She gave a brief nod that included Lacey. Ethan said, "This is Lacey." "Lacey, Nora, we used to
Date, 2 words. Used to? Delivered easily, with no particular care in the packaging. He had said this version many times. It was not unkind. He had simply moved on, so he has no reason to acknowledge the weight of what he was carrying past. Lacey looked Nora over. The look lasted about 2 seconds. She found nothing to concern her, and that conclusion was visible on her face without instant. Few minutes into social exchange. "How is the Institute? Still in the same job? How nice." Then Ethan looked down at Nora's left hand. He said, Still no ring. Huh, casual, light. Not a weapon.
Just a question from a man who understood that some questions weapons look at whether you intend them that way or not. He said, "Still looking? Or are you still doing that whole I don't need that thing?" Lacey extended her left hand slightly. He smiled. The engagement ring caught the gala light. 3 carats, white gold setting. Lacey was genuinely happy and wanted to share it. That did not make the moment easier. 2 people nearby heard.
Someone laughed softly, not unkindly, because Ethan's question had landed like normal social conversation to everyone who didn't know why it wasn't. Nora did not respond for a full beat. There were many things she could have said. None of them were the right things to say to this person in this room tonight. The map in her coat pocket, the man from the archive, the father she was trying to understand. The 8 months of carrying everything without putting it down once. She said, voice level, no ring, just work. And she walked to the other side of the room and continued her evening. Dennis materialized beside her 5 minutes later. He had seen the exchange. He has nothing about it. He handed her a glass of water and said, the 1890 land deed collection came in this afternoon. You're going to want to see it. That was the right thing to do. Not bigger, not smaller. Just a reason to stay standing. The following morning, she met Callaghan in a smallest room above the diner. She told him about the man she had seen watching the building, both near the Institute and the evening before. Callum confirmed. One of Senator Mast's people. They had been tracking her. He said, they came to the event looking for you specifically. I had 2 people there. They watched to check your name against the guest list before you arrived. Nora said, you had people at the event. He said, I've had people near you since the night you found the map. She said, and you didn't tell me. He said, you didn't know you needed to know yet. She said, that's not your decision to make. He says, you're right. No defense. Clean acknowledgement. It won't happen again. They looked at each other. This was the first agreement. She did not trust him. She trusted the fact that her father had trusted him, and her father had been the most careful man she had ever known. Whatever Callum Reyes was, Edmund Voss had believed he was worth mapping. That was enough to begin. His office was on the 14th floor of a commercial building in Chicago's West Loop. No name on the door. Nothing distinguishing about the exterior. Inside was different. Nora had expected something that matched the category she tipped him in, something deliberately sparse or deliberately impressive, the way people who operate in his world sometimes built their spaces to communicate a message. What she found instead was a working room, the room of a person who actually worked. Maps covered the walls, not framed prints or decorative reproductions, real working maps of Chicago across different periods. 1871, 1920, 1968, 2010. Each one annotated in ballpoint pen with Indian guards pinned nearby and strings connecting points of interest. This was not decoration. This was how Callum Reyes thought. His actual desk, she realized, was vertical and covered 3 walls. Woven between his printed maps were hand-drawn ones. She recognized the penmanship immediately. She said, that's my father's work. Callum said, 12 years of it. He updated them every quarter. She moved closer, touched one of the maps with her fingertips, not to take it, just to feel the paper. The particular texture of her father's preferred drafting paper. He had ordered it by the case from a specialty supplier. She said, he never showed me these. Callum said, he was protecting you. She said, from what? He said, from knowing what he knew. It wasn't possible to know and be safe. He chose your safety. She did not answer. But she looked at the maps longer than she meant to, and something inside her was making a decision. They spread her map and went to work. She decoded quickly. She had done this before, years ago, but the system came back to her within minutes. She explained as she went, not for his benefit, but because saying it aloud helped her think. The geographic language becoming human language. A name here, a relationship there, a flow of money between 2 points. She talked fast and precisely. He kept up with her, asking nothing she did not need him to ask, supplying context she did not have. This was what surprised her most. He was not slow. He was not demanding clarification on obvious things the way people sometimes did when they wanted to seem thoughtful. He understood quickly and quietly and moved forward with her. When she asked about a specific location, a notation in the southwest section she could not fully interpret without outside context, he went to his filing cabinet, third drawer from the left. He counted 6 folders in from the left edge and removed the correct one without searching. Exactly the way she moved through her archive, she said, "You organize by the same system my father used," he said. "He taught me." A small pause. She looked back the map, but something had shifted. Not full trust, recognition. This person had known her father in the real way, not the public way, not the professional biography way. He had known the system, the private language, the methodology that Edmund Voss had built over decades. They worked through the afternoon.
Mom.
By the end of it, the picture that emerged was larger than either of them had expected. Nora said, slowly, he wasn't just mapping relationships. He was mapping evidence. Callum did not respond immediately. She continued, every transaction, every meeting, every money transfer. He tracked all of it for 20 years. And he didn't keep it in one place. She traced several notations with her finger. He divided it, broke it into pieces, 7 different locations. She paused on one symbol near the upper right of the map, Chicago, Milwaukee, and one more. She looked up. She said Boston. Callum said yes. She said where Jake goes to school. He said yes. Jake doesn't know. No. She absorbed that for a moment. Then she said he built a library. Callum said quietly. He built a bomb. She said, and he left the detonator to me. No one spoke for a while after that. Outside, Chicago's November afternoon was moving toward dark. Inside the office, in the maps on the walls, her father's work surrounded them both. Then Callum sat down. He set his pen down carefully, the way a person sets something down when they are about to say something that requires both hands free. He said, "There's something I need to put on the table. Something's out at your safety." She waited. He said, "Someone broke into the archive the night after you found from the map. They were not looking for the map. They were looking for you. Mast knows your name, and now that his people have confirmed you found the donation box, you are the target. Not a potential lead, the target." Nora said, "I know." He said, "Living alone, working in a public institution, paying your brother's tuition. These are pressure points, places where someone can reach you." She said, "Tell me what you're suggesting." He said, "There is a structure that protects people in the world I operate in. It's not perfect, but it is effective. If you are my wife, legally and on record at City Hall, you are no longer a civilian. You become part of a protection network that must, and Saunders moving against you would mean moving against me. And there are certain actions that even a senator running for governor does not take against someone in my position." The room was very quiet. Nora said, "You're proposing marriage of protection." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not a real marriage." He looked at her steadily. He said, "That depends on what you consider real. Legally binding, fully executed, on record. I'm not proposing fiction. I'm proposing a documented fact that serves both of us." She said, "What do you get?" He said, "I get it to finish what your father started without worrying that the only person who can read his maps is being used against me." She stood, walked to the window, looked at the street below. She said 3 conditions. He said, "Tell me." She said, "First, Jake does not know unless his safety requires assess. Second, I keep my job, my apartment, my life. This exists on paper, not in how I live. Third, when this is finished, we end it cleanly." He said, "Agreed." She turned around. "And I won't wear a ring in public, not until we know who is watching and why. My name on a marriage certificate is a ring at work." She looked at her bare left hand. She thought about Ethan's question the night before, casual and weightless, still no ring. She thought about her father's maps on these walls, 12 years of them, his handwriting, in every room she entered now. She said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow. City Hall. 30 minutes. Phil is the witness." She nodded once, picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped and did not turn around. She said, "He was right about the filing system. Yours is better organized than mine." She left before he could answer. City Hall, 9:15. In the registrar. Office of the Civil, no flowers, no special occasion clothes. Callum was wearing the same gray V sweater on he had worn in the archive reading room. Nora was in her work coat. Phil Dragomir stood by the door, hands at his sides, the only witness. The registrar was in her early 50s named Margaret. 22 years in this office, which meant she had seen every possible variation of the thing she was asked to document. She moved through the paperwork with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to project meaning onto an event she was only a small part of. The procedure took 23 minutes. When Margaret pressed the official seal onto the document, Nora looked down at it. Her name, Callum's name, a date. City of Chicago. Margaret said, "Would you like a coppa to take with you?" Callum said, "Yes," before Nora could open her mouth. Outside, on the steps of City Hall, Phil walked ahead of them by 20 feet, giving them room. The November wind came off the lake with its particular authority. A thin sus offered light without warmth. Nora said, "Tess worked, son. I'm going to work now." Callum said, "I know." She said, "Nothing changes at the Institute." He said, "Nothing changes." She walked. He watched her go. His hands were at his sides, and she was walking away with no visible mirror of what had just happened, which was correct, which was the plan, which was the sensible decision both of them had made. He stood on the steps until she turned the corner. They were back at work by 2 in the afternoon. Nora brought sandwiches. She did not explain or make anything of it. She simply set one in front of Callum's Anderson's and sat down with her own. He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know. Eat." He ate. He did not thank her with words, but he ate the way a person lay when they are actually paying attention to it, not just fueling, and she recognized that as a kind of acknowledgement. They spent the next hour working through the second section of the map in near silence. No background noise. No filler conversation, just the work and the quiet of two people who had no need to fill silence with sound. She noticed while they worked that Callum kept a notebook, not for notes but for questions. Each question was written on a separate line, and each one was crossed out when it had been answered. She glanced at it once when he set it down to get a folder. Most of the questions on the current page were not crossed out. He was a person who lived with more unanswered questions than resolved. He did not appear to be bothered by this. He appeared to treat it seriously, the state of things. Around 4 in the afternoon, Nora's phone rang. Jake. She switched modes instantly and without visible effort. Warm, present, engaged. Jake wanted to come to Chicago for the weekend. The Polish restaurant their father had always taken them to. The one on Milwaukee Avenue with the painted wooden tables, he wanted to go there. She said yes. She said to date. She said she was looking forward to it. When she hung up, the warmth stayed in her face for exactly 2 seconds after the call ended. It faded back to what it usually was. Callum said without looking up from the files, "He doesn't know. Not a question." Nora said, "He is finishing his degree. He has a thesis, a girlfriend, and a life that has nothing to do with this." Callum said, "He'll find out eventually." Nora said, "Eventually isn't now." Callum set down his pen. He looked at her in a way that was different from the way he looked at the map. Not assessing data, something else. He said, "Your father did the same thing, carried it alone, protected everyone from knowing." Nora said, "Is that a warning?" He said, "An observation. The Voss family has a pattern." She knew he was next right. Knowing he was right did not help anything. An hour later, she decoded a name from the second section that neither of them had been expecting. She said this one. "Do you know anyone named Daniel?" A pause that lasted slightly longer than his usual pauses. He said, "My younger brother." Nora waited. He said, "He worked in finance. Smart. Very careful, good at making numbers invisible in plain sight. He had been building a case against people I had been watching for years. He didn't tell me because he thought I would stop him." She said, "What happened?" He said, "He disappeared on a Thursday. They found his car by the river 3 days later. No body." He said it the way a person reads a file summary, even, precise, emotional markers. Nora understood this was not because he was not in pain. It was because he had said this to himself so many times that it had lost its shape. Loss, practice enough, becomes something you can hold without dropping, even if you never stop feeling its weight. She said, "That's why you started all of this." He said, "That's why I became very good at knowing things before they become problems." Yes. Nora looked at the name on the map again. Daniel. Her father had put it there. Her father had known. Her father had tracked what happened to this man and recorded it in his private language. She said, "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It's all here." Callum's hands, flat on the table, did not move. He said, "Show me." She did not point at the map from across the table. She stood, walked around to his side, placed the map between them, and read it to him, item by item, slowly, not because he couldn't read it himself, because this was news about his brother, and some things should not be read alone. When she finished, he did not speak. They stood looking at the map together for about 30 seconds. No words from either of them. Then he said quietly, "He left a record for everyone he lost. Your father was very thorough." She said, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." They stayed late. When Nora finally got up to leave, Callum held the map's cardboard tube for her while she packed it. He said, "Same time tomorrow?" She said, "I have work until noon." After that, he said, "I'll have food here." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You don't have to," he said. "You brought sandwiches this morning." She said, "That was different." He said, "Was it?" She did not answer. She took her bag and went to the door. The elevator going down, Phil held the door open for her longer than necessary. She looked at him. He gave a small nod, the kind that means something without specifying what. She nodded back. She rode down to the lobby thinking about the way Callum had said his brother's name. Like the loss was still ongoing. Like it had not finished happening yet. She knew that grammar. She had been speaking for 8 months. 3 mornings later, Nora arrived at the Hargrove Institute and knew within 90 seconds that someone had been in the archive overnight. Nothing was taken, nothing visibly disturbed. But a document box on the third shelf had been returned at a 2-centimeter offset from where she always placed it. Someone careful had opened and closed it. Someone who knew how to be careful. And someone who had not accounted for the fact that Nora Voss knew the location of 34,000 items and would notice the 2 centimeters. She called Callum. He arrived in 20 minutes and treated her archive the way she would have wanted someone to treat it. He did not touch anything he did not need not to. He observed before he spoke. When he reported back, he addressed her as if she were the one in charge of the space, because she was. He said, "3 people had access last night. 2 are your colleagues." The third came through the loading dock, through a 14-second camera blind spot that repeats every hour on the hour. Someone said to study this building. Nora said, "You mapped my building." He says, "I map buildings when we're people I'm responsible for spend time." She said, "Am I someone you're responsible for?" He looked at her. He said, "You're my wife. On paper, which is the only paper that matters in the world I operate in. Not romantic, practical." But she saw something he said that went slightly beyond practical. That afternoon, they met a woman named Vera Donovan. She ran a small chain of dry cleaning businesses on the North Side. She was 52, wore a tailored blazer, and moved through the restaurant, where they met with the particular authority of someone who has never had to announce their importance. In practice, Vera Donovan managed the flow of information across 2/3 of Chicago's North Side neighborhoods. She had known Edmund Voss. She had known Callum for 15 years. She looked at Nora for a long moment when they sat down. Then she said, "Edmund's daughter." Nora said, "You knew my father." Vera said, "Everyone who mattered knew Edmund." She turned to Callum. "The person you're looking for isn't small. Someone has been very patient and very quiet for a long time. And whoever it is, they are not interested in the archive. They are interested in her." She indicated Nora with a small tilt of her head. That evening was the Art Institute Gala. The Hargrove Institute was one of the event's organizing partners, and Nora's presence was expected. After what Vera had told them, Callum did not let her go alone. The ring was at home. Nothing about how she looked had changed. Ethan Cole was there with Lacey's had been invited by one of the lead donors, and Ethan had come along. He was in a good mood. He had been at the open bar long enough to shed his usual social calibration. He spotted Nora near one of the exhibition rooms and came over. Callum was standing with Phil a few steps away, and Ethan did not register either of them. Ethan said, "Hey, Nora." Didn't expect to see you again so soon. He was warm about it. Genuinely pleasant, he said. You know, I was thinking about what you said the other night. Just work. He glanced around the room. Come on. You're 28. Don't you ever think about you know? He gestured in Lacey's direction where the engagement ring all of this? Someone. A ring. The whole picture. Nora said, all of what? He said, stability. Someone in your corner. He delivered this as useful advice. He genuinely believed he was being helpful. You were always so inside your own head. Some guy is going to have to be very patient. He laughed, easy and light. 3 or 4 people nearby heard it. Nora looked at him. She felt the familiar weight of the moment. Not fresh pain. More like a scar being pressed. Something she had felt often enough to know exactly what it was. She said, I'll keep that in mind. Then she stepped sideways, not away from Ethan, but toward Callum. He was right there, and she moved toward him, the way you move toward the door of a place that belongs to you, without thinking about it. Callum placed his hands lightly on her shoulder. Not a performance, not a statement. The casual placement of someone stood beside the same person enough times that the gesture no longer requires consideration. Ethan looked at this man. He did not know the name. He did not know the occupation. But Phil Dragomir was standing exactly 3 steps back with that exact posture of a professional whose only job is to watch a room while someone else is in it. And Callum was looking at Ethan Cole the way a surveyor looks at an irrelevant detail. Noted, filed, not requiring additional time. Ethan said nothing more. Lacey appeared at his elbow and steered him toward another group without appearing to do it on purpose. Nora did not watch him go. Callum said, low and quiet, just loud enough for her. Do you need anything? She said. No. He said, are you sure? She looked up at him. She said, he used to make me feel like I wasn't enough. The strange part is, I keep waiting for that feeling to come back and it doesn't. He did not respond. His hand stayed on her shoulder. On the way back, on the sidewalks outside, Callum told her the thing he had been holding back. He said, your father did not leave the map in the archive by accident. He arranged for that donation box to reach your archive. Your shift, after his death, he planned it. Nora stopped walking. He said he knew someone was going to come for him eventually. He didn't know when. So he built a failsafe. She said, me. He said, you. He spent 20 years protecting you from this world. The last things he did was decide you were the only one who could finish what he had started. Stood still on the sidewalk for a long moment. The lake wind moved around her. She thought about her father sitting at his drafting table, building her into it. Not because he ran out of options, because he trusted her. She said, he could have destroyed it all. Callum said, yes. She said, he chose not to. Callum said, he chose you. She nodded once, slowly, and started walking again. They finished decoding the map the following evening. The last section confirmed what the earlier sections had suggested. 7 evidence caches, Chicago, Milwaukee, and a location in Boston that was within 3 blocks of Jenks University. Edmund had placed one piece where his son was not to endanger him, but because it was the one location where he knew it would be safe for as long as Jake was there, unknown and unreachable to anyone looking. Nora said, Jake doesn't know what's hidden near him. Callum said, no. If Mast figures out the full map eventually, that's why we need to move faster than eventually. The question of whether to tell Jake sat between them, like something tray on the table neither of them was ready to pick up. Callum ordered food from the Polish restaurant down the street. He did not ask what she had eaten. He simply ordered for both of them and set a container in front of her when it arrived. They ate at the work table with the map folded and set aside. First time in days they were not looking at it. Nora said, how did you learn to read maps? The way you actually read them, not just geographically. He said, there was a lot when I was growing up. A man named Andre used it every day. He was retired Polish, had been a surveyor in his first life. He believed maps were the only honest way to understand people. Nora said, what did he mean by that? Callum said, he said, show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go at night, and I will show you everything about them that their words will never tell you. Nora says, and my father said something like that. Callum said, I know. He quoted Andre often. She looked up. You knew each other a long time, he said. 15 years. A pause. Then he said, he came to me when Daniel disappeared. He was the only person as outside my organization who knew to come to me. He said he had been watching me Shimbo for years. I was the only person he had seen who mapped people to protect them, not to use them. She said, is that still true? He set his fork down. He looked at the table, not at her. He said, it used to be cleaner than it is now. I started in one place and I became something different over time. And then your father kept mapping me anyway. Kept updating the record. Kept including me in the people he tracked. I never understood why. She said, because he thought you could come back. He looked at her. He did not have an answer for that. The message came in 9:40. One of Callum's contacts had been compromised. Exposure risk, active situation. He was on his feet before he finished reading it. The room changed around him. He made 2 calls in under 90 seconds, spoke in short, precise sentences, and moved through the space with the particular efficiency of someone doing something they have done many times under pressure. No excess movement, no wasted words. Nora watched him. In the middle of the second call, he looked up and his eyes found her across the room, not checking that she was something else. Like finding a fixed point, like a compass needle settling. The situation was contained in 12 minutes. He just stood at the window afterward, looking out at the city. She came to stand beside him. Then he said, I have been doing this as alone for 11 years. It is easier alone. You make decisions faster, she said. He said, but tonight I looked up and you were in the room. And something in the decision became clearer. She said, Callum, I need to tell you something. He said, tell me. She said, I think I know what my father was saying, not just with the map. She paused. He was saying, don't look away from it, and don't face it alone. He looked at her. The distance between them narrowed, not because either of them moved, but because both of them stopped maintaining it. He placed his hand over hers. The way someone sets something fragile on a surface. She did not pull back. They stood at the window with Chicago spread out below them, hand in hand. No one said anything. Later she would think about that moment, the way you think about the last warm day before the cold arrives. You don't know it's the last one until it's already behind you. 3 days later, Marcus Webb contacted Nora directly. She did not know his name yet, only that the message had arrived through a secondary number she used for archive correspondence, which meant someone had done research before reaching out. The message was brief. He said he had been a colleague of her father's. He says there was something she needed to know. He said she would not hear it from Callum Srias. She met him on a bench in Millennium Park. He was 63, wearing a heavy wool coat, his hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. He looked tired in the way people look when they have been carrying something too long. He said, your father was my friend for 20 years. I was not involved in what he was building, but I knew it existed. I watched from the outside. Nora said, what do you want to tell me? He said, Callum Reyes received intelligence 1 week before Edmund died. Specific intelligence, not a general warning. A threat report that included your father's names. Nora sat very still. Webb said, he did not warn him. She said nothing. He said, I don't know why. I'm not saying it was malicious. I'm saying it happened, and I think you deserve to know before you hand everything Edmund built to the man who might have been able to prevent his death. Nora stood, walked 10 feet, turned around. She said, where did you get this information? Webb did not answer immediately. She said, you're either telling me the truth or you are the one who killed him. Which is it? He said, it's not that simple. She said, yes, it is. She left him there. She went directly to Callum's office. Phil let her in without a word. Callum was at his desk. He looked up when she entered. He did not speak first. She said, did you know someone was going to come for my father? 1 week before he died? He looked at her.
He did not answer immediately. The pause was 2 seconds, maybe less. But it was there, and she heard it the way you hear a note that is slightly wrong in a piece of music you know very well. She said, tell me. He said, I received a warning, not specific. General, someone in the network was at risk. I increased security on 3 people. Your father was not on that list because the intelligence as received indicated the threat was directed at me, not him. She said, but he died.
Not you. Yes, she said. And you have known this for 8 months. He said yes. She looked at him. She had been in this room for more than a week. She had sat across this table and read her father's maps and told Callum things she had not told another person. She had signed a legal document with him, and in all of that time, he had known this and had not said it. She said, "You let me spend a week in this room, reading my father's work, telling you things I haven't told anyone. You signed a marriage certificate beside me, and that the whole time you knew that you might have been able to save him." He said, "I didn't know." She said, "You knew enough to wonder, and you chose not to tell me." He did not defend himself. He did not reach for an apology which she would have heard as empty, and he seemed to understand that. He said, "I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop, and I needed you to finish the map." Silence, a long one. Then she said, "At least that's honest." One of Callum's people walked in without knocking. Mast was moving. He had located Jake's university address in Boston, and a contact there had received an inquiry about Jake Voss's daily schedule. Callum handled it in under 3 minutes. He made calls, issued precise directives, got confirmation. Jake's location was secured. Jake was safe. Watched Tim Zaw do every part of it correctly. Fast, calm, and thorough. He protected the brother of the person he had not been able to protect. She put on her coat. Callum said, "Nora." She said, "Jake is safe. That's what matters right now." He said, "I should have told you." She said, "Yes." She stopped at the door. She did not turn around. She said, "The map is decoded. You have everything you need to finish what my father started. You don't need me for that anymore." He said, That's," she said. "Good night, Callum." She walked out. The door closed behind her. He stood in the office looking at the door, then at the map on the table, then at the 2 coffee cups near the window, one of them hers, left over from the previous afternoon, still half full. He had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone. He had known exactly what it would cost her to learn about the warning. He had told himself the mission came first. And he had known, with the same precision he applied to everything else, that he was lying to himself. Some things you know and still choose not to act on. Those are always the things that cost the most. 3 days. No contact. Nora was not idle. She worked through the map's location references on her own. She used what she had learned from their sessions together and traced each cache point, cross-referencing against the historical records available in her archive. She did not go to the locations. She went to the records. This was what she was trained to do. Understand the landscape before you enter it. And in doing that work, she read her father's maps differently than she had before. She read them as the complete body of work they were, not just the immediate practical guide she had been treating them as. And what she saw was a man who had known what he was doing for a very long time. Her father had documented the darker chapters of Reyes alongside the more defensible ones. He had seen all of it. He had made a choice repeatedly over 15 years to continue working with this man anyway. She was not forgiving Callum. She was trying to understand her father. Jake called on the second day. She had missed 2 of his earlier calls and he was worried. She told him something close to the truth, not all of it. She said their father had been involved in something important and dangerous and that she was working to finish it. She said Edmund had done it because he believed it mattered. She said he had loved both of them in the only way he knew how. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Did he trust you to finish it?" Nora said yes. Jake said, "Then finish it, Nora." That's what he was saying. She sat with that for a while after she hung up. Callum, meanwhile, did not look for her. He had said he would give her space. He kept his word. He was not someone who broke agreements, even informal ones. He met Marcus Webb, not to confront him, to listen. They sat in the same diner in Pilsen, where Callum had met Nora weeks before. Webb was defensive at first. Callum was not aggressive. He simply waited the way he waited for most things, with a patience that had nothing passive about it. Webb said, "Edmund didn't just trust you with the work. He trusted you with his daughter's safety. That's a different kind of trust. That's trusting you with what mattered most." Callum said, "I failed him. Webb said, "You failed him once. You spent 8 months after that not failing everyone else." He paused. "The question is not what you did. The question is what you do now that you understand what it costs." Callum returned to his office. He opened his computer, created a new file, typed 2 words, Nora Voss. He looked at the blank document for a long time, then he closed it. He did not delete it. He did not fill it in, he just closed it. It was the first time in 11 years that he had chosen not to build a files on someone who mattered to him. He did not fully understand what that meant yet. He suspected it was significant. Senator Mast moved that week. He used political channels to request that the Hargrove Institute surrender documents potentially relevant to an ongoing federal review. It was perfectly legal. It was also a clean and untraceable way to eliminate everything Edmund Voss had carefully placed in Nora's archive. Callum responded with the only weapon that never required physical presence. He released preliminary documentation of Mast's connection to the archive break-in to 3 independent journalists at the same time, not enough to prosecute. Enough for Mast to understand, move further, and the story becomes public. Mast stopped moving. It was a delay, not a solution. The full evidence was still in 7 locations. It still needed to be assembled and placed correctly. And the only person who could navigate the complete map was not returning his calls. He could have found her. He could find anyone. But finding her and having the right to ask her to come back were 2 entirely different things. He waited. For the first time in 11 years, he simply waited. 7 days. Nora arrived at Callum's office on a Tuesday morning. She did not call ahead. She simply arrived. Phil was at the lobby door when she came through. The way he opened the door was different from the first time. Not the door opening for a stranger, the door opening for someone who belongs. Callum was at his desk. He put down his book when she walked in. He set it down carefully, with the particular attention of someone setting aside something that matters. She stood in the doorway. She said, "I have 2 conditions." He said, "Tell me." She said, "First, if you receive information that affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me. Right away. Not after you have decided whether it serves the mission." He said, "Agreed." She said, "Second, when this is over, I want to know everything. Not a summary. Everything. I will decide what to do with it." He said, "That's not a simple ask." She said, "I know. It's what I need." He said, "Agreed." She walked into the room. She said, "I'm not saying I've forgiven you." He said, "I'm not asking you to." She said, "I'm saying I understand why you made the choice you made. I think you were wrong. I think you know you were wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's enough to continue." She set her coat on the chair she had always used. She said, "Show me where we are." They went back to work. Something was different, and both of them knew it. There was less performance in the room, no careful positioning, no measured distance. Just 2 people doing difficult work together with nothing left to pretend about. On Dad's desk was a book she had not seen before. A history of cartographic practice in Chicago, covering the years her father had worked. She looked at it for a moment. He was studying Edmund's field, not for leverage, not to seem informed, to understand the man. She did not comment, but something in her that had been holding a particular tension released slightly. That afternoon, they needed to reach the first cache location in person. A storage unit in Bridgeport that Edmund had rented under a secondary name, paying 2 years in advance, setting the whole thing in motion long before the danger became immediate. Mast's people were in the area. The situation compressed quickly. The direct route was covered. A secondary route was narrowing. Callum assessed and began issuing directions. Nora said, "Wait, wait." He stopped. She said, "The service entrance on the east side of the building. They are watching the main lobby and the stairwells. They are not watching the east." He looked at the building layout in his head. He looked at her. He said, "Go." They came out clean. No contact, no incident. Walking back to where Phil had the car, "Callum, you were right." She said, "I know." He said, "About the exit." She said, "I know." A pause. Then he said, in the quieter register he used for things he meant more than usual, "You would have made a very good cartographer." She understood what he was actually saying. She did not answer with words. But the careful distance she'd been maintaining since her return dissolved on its own, without announcement. That evening they sat at the office without the map on the table for the first time. No immediate task in front of them. Just the two of them and the cities outside the window. She said, "My father left me a note. Not in the map. Separate. I found it while I was home. What did it say?" He said, "The most important thing I ever mapped was the people worth protecting." He listed 3 names. She paused. "Mine. Jake's." Another pause. The office was very quiet. Callum said, "He listed me." Nora says, "He listed you." He looked at his hand. She could see him processing it, understanding what it did and did not mean. Her father had written that note before Callum made the wrong call. It was not absolution, but it was something. A record of what Edmund had seen in this man before the failure, which was different from pretending the failure hadn't happened. She said, "He wasn't saying you're perfect. He was saying you're worth it." Clem said, "Those aren't the same thing." She said, "No, they're not." She looked at him. I think he was right about both. They collected all 7 pieces over the following week. The Chicago caches required 3 separate trips, each one carefully planned, each one clean. Milwaukee piece required a day's drive and Callum's contact there. The Boston piece was Jake. She told her brother enough to help him find it. He found it in a storage locker at a facility 3 blocks from his apartment, rented under their mother's maiden name, paid 2 years in advance. Jake sent photographs first, then drove it to Chicago himself on a Friday. Arriving at the Institute in the late afternoon with a card box and the expression of a person just understood something large about a person they thought they already understood completely. When all 7 pieces were together, spread across Callum's work table in the order Edmund had intended, the full picture became clear. It was not simply evidence against Senator Mast, though it was that too. It was 20 years of documentation of how political power and organized influence had grown together in Chicago. The specific mechanisms of it, the names and dates and traditions, the careful accounting of how systems that were supposed to work separately had in fact been working together for the better part of 2 decades. Edmund had not built it to destroy everything. He had built it to be found. To survive long enough to be found by the right person, in the right place, at the right time, Callum said, quietly. He built a library and then made sure his daughter was the librarian. They were quiet with that for a moment. Then Callum said, "He didn't want this in the courts. Most of it would be suppressed or challenged into irrelevance. He didn't want it in the press. It would be attacked before it could land." He paused. He wanted it in the archive, at Hargrove. Under historical record protections, coded in a way that only the right person could navigate. Nora said, "My archive." He said, "Yes." She understood all of it then. Her father's job at the Institute, the long careful years of building credibility there, the way he had made sure she understood the archive systems and its protections. He had not been placing documents for her to find. He had been placing her in a position to keep them safe. Callum met Senator Mast the following afternoon. A conference room in a building on Michigan Avenue. Neutral ground, no weapons, just information. He set a summary document on the table in front of the senator, a digest of 20 years of Edmund Voss's work, organized clearly, without editorial comment. Callum said, "This is going into a historical archive, sealed for 25 years. By then, either the landscape has changed enough that it no longer matters, or it matters enough that it should be found." Mast looked at the document. He did not speak. Callum said, "If you move against anyone connected to this, Nora Voss, her brother, anyone at the Hargrove Institute, it goes public. All of it. Tomorrow." Mast said, "Expose yourself," Callum said. Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something that protected people. He paused. "I'm in the business of honoring that. What I expose doesn't matter as much as what I protect." He meant it, every word of it. Nora was not in the room to hear it. She would never hear it repeated exactly that way, but he meant it, which was the only part that mattered. Mast looked at the document for a long time. Then he stood and left the room without another word. That evening, the Hargrove Institute held a small reception for the unveiling of a new historical collection. Staff, major donors, a few academics. Nora had curated the collection herself. Callum came with her. He was not there as protection, not as a presence. He came because it was her world, and he was learning what it meant to be someone who belonged in her world. The Tist was still at home. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Ethan Coles was there with Lacey. She had been invited by one of the collection's donors. Ethan was in the room for approximately 40 minutes before he saw Nora. He saw Callum first. He watched the man standing beside Nora and tried to place him. No recognition. No name. But Phil Dragomir stood exactly 3 steps back from Callum, with the particular stillness of a professional whose job is to be the last person you notice until you need to. And Callum Reyes was looking at the room the way a person looks at terrain they have already mapped, easy and thorough, and completely unhurried. Ethan did not approach. He did not make a comment about rings. He did not say anything to Nora at all. About 20 minutes later, standing through the refreshment table with Lacey, he said, low and without intending it to carry, I didn't know she was with someone. Lacey looked in Callum's direction. Then she looked back at Ethan. She said, you wouldn't have. No drama in it. No pointed emphasis. Just the truth finding its way to the right place. The way water finds slow ground, without effort, without announcement. Nora did not hear it. She was across the room. A 19th century research from North Survey map to a researcher from Northwestern. And she was happy in the precise quiet way that comes from doing the work you were built to do in the place where it matters. Late that night, after the reception, she returned to the archive with Callum to prepare the final paperwork for Edmund's materials. The building was empty. The archive was dark except for her desk lamp and the soft glow from the hallway. She placed the 7 pieces of evidence into their proper archival housings. She cataloged them under their correct historical classifications, flagged with appropriate access restrictions, dated and signed, and entered into the permanent record of the Hargrove Institute for Historical Research. Her father's work, properly kept. When she was nearly done, she was separate shelf, one she had been watching for 3 weeks, and removed a small box. She set it on the table in front of Callum. She said, my father left one more thing, not in the map, not in the note. He cataloged it here in the archive itself, under my employee number, flagged for my attention. He looked at the box, she said, his journals, 20 years of them. Everything he thought, but never coded into the maps. She pushed the box gently toward him. He cataloged them for you, your access, not mine. He knew you would be here. Callum looked at the box for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He said, he mapped everything. She said, everything worth keeping. She finished the last of her work and turned off for the cataloging station. The archive settled into a nighttime quiet, the smell of old paper and cool air, and the particular stillness of a room full of things that have survived a long time. Callum said, Nora, what do you want after this? She said, I want to keep doing what I do. Cataloging things, finding what people leave behind. A pause, and I want to stop carrying things alone. He said, what about the marriage? She said, what about it? He said, you said clean dissolution when it was over. She looked at him. A long moment. She said, I think I changed my mind. He was still. She said, there's a research consultation position here. Part-time. Someone who understands how to read patterns in historical records. It pays badly. He said, I don't need the money. She said, I know. He said, are you offering me a job, Miss Voss? She said, I'm offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice if you don't. He crossed the room slowly. He placed his hand against her face, his fingertips at her cheekbone, the way she read maps. Careful, present, testing whether something is real. She did not move. He said, I'll show up. 6 months later, an afternoon in late April, Chicago's spring arrived the way it always did, sudden and a little aggressive, like a guest who had been waiting outside too long. The lake air came off the water with something warmer in it. The trees in Grant Park opened up almost overnight. The city, which had been gray and patient all winter, remembered itself. The archive at the Hargrove Institute had 2 desks now. The second one was not attached to a staff position and did not appear on any organizational chart. It held notebooks, several pamphlets, a growing collection of reference materials, and a copy of a historical survey of Chicago neighborhoods that had been annotated in a small, precise handwriting. Callum was there 3 afternoons a week. His formal operations had not disappeared. That would not have been honest. He still moved through the information networks he had built over 11 years, still made decisions that had weight in the city's less visible structures. But he was changing how he operated, decision at a time, in the direction he had begun moving the night. He told a senator that what he exposed mattered less than what he protected. He and Nora were building something, a long-term historical documentation project, mapping how Chicago's neighborhoods had changed across periods of the city's development. It was real work. It was work that mattered. It was also, not incidentally, the kind of archive that could absorb and protect a great deal of other information without raising questions. Her father would have appreciated the design in. Jake came down from Boston on a weekend in May. He had finished his degree and was weighing a job offer in Chicago, which was not entirely unrelated to his sister being in Chicago and his sister's husband. Jake had decided, after considerable private deliberation, he was glad existed. He told Nora this on the sidewalk outside this restaurant, the Polish place on Milwaukee Avenue with the painted wooden tables, while Sekim was inside paying the check. Jake said, "He's kind of terrifying." Nora said, "He's kind of everything." Jake looked at the restaurant window, where Callum was visible at the host stand, saying something to Phil, who stood in his usual position 3 steps back. Jake said, "Dad would have liked him." Nora did not answer, but she did not deny it either, and Jake knew her well enough to know the difference. On a Tuesday afternoon in late April, Nora put on the ring. Not for anyone to see, not as a statement, not because the danger was gone, because danger of one kind or another is never entirely gone for anyone, but because she had decided there was no longer a reason to keep this particular truth hidden from the world. She put it on in the archive, alone, before anyone else arrived, the way you do a thing when you're doing it for yourself and not for an audience. Dennis Cascaway came through the archive an hour later, with a stack of periodicals for the reading room. He's noticed the ring when she handed him an intake form. He looked at her hand, looked up at her, and said nothing. Just gave a small nod, the kind of nod you give when you see something good happening to someone who has been quiet and patient and working hard for a long time. Then he went on with his day. Phil noticed too. Phil noticed everything. He was standing near the building entrance when Nora and Callum left that evening, and he gave Callum a nod that was different from his usual one. Not the nod from a security professional to the person they're protecting, just a nod from one person to another. Something simple and human and earned. That evening, Nora walked the archive, turning off the lights the way she always did, row by row, from the back of the stacks to the front. The famous physics, each section going dark in turn, 34,000 documents settling into the nighttime quiet that they had been settling into for years before her and would continue to settle into for years after. Killam stood at the door with his coat over his arm, waiting. Not impatiently, just waiting the way someone waits for something they are certain about. She turned off the last light. She walked toward him through the dark. She knew every step of the distance by memory. He said, "Ready." She said, "Ready." They went out. The door closed behind them. The archive held what it held, the way it always had, patient and permanent, and full of things that had survived long enough to matter. Her father had spent 20 years mapping what mattered. She understood now what he had been moving toward. Not an archive of damage, a record of what was worth protecting. She had his hands, his habit of careful attention. His particular faith that the right things, properly kept, would outlast the wrong ones. She carried that forward. She carried it alongside someone who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone and was learning slowly that the things most worth knowing are the ones you let yourself not know in advance. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's 20 years of work. It held, in a sealed and restricted section, everything Callum Reyes had done and survived. And it held, in no file and no catalog, the quiet, that settles into a room when two people have stopped performing, started so simply being. That was worth keeping too. That was the cartographer's daughter's work. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
There is a moment in this story that most people will remember long after the plot fades. It is not the dramatic confrontation. It is not the moment the senator backs down. It is a much quieter moment. A woman standing in a crowded room, a man laughing at her empty hand, and her choosing to say nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, because she had already moved beyond needing him to understand. That is the first lesson the story carries. The people who underestimate you are not your problem to fix. They are simply people who cannot see far enough. You do not owe them a correction. You do not owe them a demonstration. You owe them nothing at all. The most powerful response to being underestimated is not anger, and it is not revenge. It is continuing to build the thing they cannot see yet. The second lesson lives in Edmund Voss, the father who never appears in a single scene, but is present in every one of them. He spent 20 years doing dangerous work in silence, protecting people who never knew his name, building something that would outlast him. He did not do it for recognition. He did not do it for safety. He did it because he believed it mattered, and he trusted that the right person would know what to do with it when the time came. That trust was his greatest act of love. There is something profound in that. The most meaningful things we build are often the ones we build for someone else to carry forward. The legacy of a good person is not what they kept. It is what they gave away to the right hands. The third lesson belongs to Callum, a man who believed that knowing everything was the same as being safe. He learned, at a cost he will never fully recover from, that information is not the same as wisdom, and control is not the same as protection. The people we love do not need us to know everything about them. They need us to trust them enough to let them stand in their own strength. The moment he closed that empty file, the moment he chose not to build a record on the woman he was beginning to love, was the moment he became something better than what he had been. And then there is Nora herself. A woman who carried grief, responsibility, and silence for 8 months without letting any of it break her form. She did not become hard. She became precise. She did not become cold. She became clear. That is the difference between a person who survives difficulty and a person who is shaped by it into something stronger. This story is not about crime. It is not about power in the way most people think about power. It is about what happens when quiet people finally have everything they need. It is about loyalty that does not require an audience. It is about love that begins as a legal document and becomes something no document could ever contain. The world will always have people who laugh at what they cannot see. Let them laugh. Keep building. Keep mapping what matters. And trust that the right people will know exactly what you left behind.